Okay, welcome to section 7 of Unit 8. We are looking at World War One in America. Last time we talked about how the United States was being pushed out of neutrality and into war. Two of the main things that pushes us in there, the sinking of the Lusitania and the promise following that sinking that Germany would never sink another ship without letting the United States know. That promise, that Sussex Pledge. But then the Zimmerman telegram coming out and saying, oh no, we are going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare and we're plotting against you with your enemy to the south, very close, the threat of continental U.S. fighting with Mexico, and this pushes the United States one step closer to declaring war. Now, when we look at mobilizing for war, we are going to see that the United States does ultimately decide to enter in, and we enter when we look at Wilson's role. Wilson looks at the increase in unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany, and he realizes he has three options. We either go with armed neutrality, where we start to build up our military ready for conflict but remain neutral, although that can be seen as a threat, or we submit to the criminal acts of Germany, allowing further acts to be committed, basically just letting Germany make us look super weak, or we can join the war. And ultimately, after March 18th, 1917, when German U boats sink three more American merchant ships without warning, officially breaking that Sussex Pledge, this is going to push Wilson to the breaking point of saying we can't let Germany continue, or else the United States is going to look weak. We can't sit on the sidelines any longer and allow more people to die. Instead, we're going to join the war. So the next day, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. The United States would enter on the side of the Allies, and war is formally declared against the Central Powers by the United States in April of 1917. This is just 3 years after the war had already begun. So we start mobilizing. During this time, we have a strong Navy that's led by the Secretary of Navy Daniels and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, no other than the absolutely amazing Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Congress, when we declare war, passes what's called the Selective Service Bill, meaning that you could be selected for service in World War One, which is also known as the draft. This is going to be supported by the people. Usually, when we think of the draft, it's not typically supported by the American people, but we were pretty angry. We're mad that Germany was threatening to get Mexico to plot against us. We're mad that Germany has been sinking our ships, and quite frankly, we're ready to fight. General John J. Pershing, the commander of the U.S. forces in Europe, is going to be sent to France on the Western Front. That long train of trench warfare, the trenches, is where we're going to be needed because that's where it was starting to weaken. At the end of the war, the United States had sent 1.2 million troops to France. More than 50,000 will be dead and many more wounded, but those numbers are nothing in comparison to what the European Allied forces had lost in this war for the 3 years before the United States joins. U.S. troops are going to initially be sent in small numbers in 1917, but what we realize is the Allied forces, like France, like Britain, like Russia, they don't have a lot of people left. They've been fighting this war for 3 years. The numbers of their side are dwindling, and you can't replenish the generation of young men that quickly. the United States had the literal life to breathe into this war, and we're going to send in large numbers men to go and fight. We aren't just going to need to send men, though. Other ways that we have to mobilize for this war, we have to shift our economy. The government is going to begin regulating what kind of goods are being produced in order to create what's called a wartime economy. So the government starts regulating what food is being produced, what coal is being used for, and what petroleum use we are using to make sure that the most we can give to war is being used. The government's going to direct what crops were being grown, what products are being produced, and how supplies were being moved. Because in order to win a war, you need to have the most supplies. And these are the kinds of posters that we use. Save the wheat, help the fleet, eat less bread. Will you have a part in victory? Attack on all fronts, showing there somebody fighting in the military the first, and then someone in the factories the second, and a woman growing our own food in the third. We have to make sure that we are prepared on all fronts, not just men going over, but our economy back at home. So, to continue this, the impact on the U.S. economy includes we created the War Industries Board. This was meant to coordinate production of munitions and regulate the supplies of the United States to be used for war. Herbert Hoover, another name that we're going to see later on, is appointed to lead the Food Administration to help with things such as on voluntary means, such as creating the idea of shared sacrifice. If everybody across the United States sacrifices a little, then we have a lot for the war. The way we're going to do this is through things like wheatless Monday and Wednesday, meatless Tuesday, porkless Thursday and Saturday. What we give up on those days are what we give to the war effort. And that's how we will help, like the poster says, the women of France, because those people over there have been fighting this war for 3 years. We over here haven't really been affected by the war, and we can help so much more if we all just give up a little. Shortages of food in the Allied countries had led to rationing across all of Western Europe, and our little bit of sacrifice here can make up for their losses over there. Other ways that we mobilized for war. First, we had victory gardens. Okay, this is the idea that people could have small background gardens, even window boxes in the cities to plant their own food instead of buying it in the store. Because if the stores didn't have to stock as much, they could send more over to those fighting in the war. During this time, we also see our government adopting the idea that had already begun over in Europe for daylight savings time. This conserves on energy, which meant that we could dedicate some of our natural resources used to power the United States into the power that we needed for the war. We also had Liberty bond drives. The US government used these bond drives to raise money to help finance the war. So they named them things that would appeal to American patriotism. Liberty bonds were an idea that were proposed by the Secretary of Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo. And when you buy Liberty bonds, Americans were essentially loaning money to the government. The US government agreed to repay the money plus interest in a specified number of years. Victory bonds were issued after the war had ended. This ensured that the banking system was not harmed. The interest rates would be paid on Liberty and Victory bonds were actually lower than those paid by banking institutions. So by the end of the war, the US government was in debt more than $25 billion. But we needed that money to fight the war, to raise money, to be successful in the war. And people were more than willing to give up that money. If it meant giving up a little bit of money now that you could get paid back with interest later on to help save American lives and win this great war, people were running to give up their money. Other pieces that we see mobilizing for war, when we look at the impact on the economy, it extends to the factories. You got to think, who is going to fight in this war? Well, the men were. Where were the men before the war? They were in the factories, in the cities. When the men leave those jobs, we now have a huge labor shortage, and we need to fill that labor shortage with somebody. And that's somebody who's going to fill it. First, we have women. Women are going to move from domestic services to the heavy industry to compensate for those labor shortages. That way, we can still keep producing to hopefully win this war. The other part that we're going to see that moves into this labor shortage is African Americans. During this time, we are going to see what's called the Great Migration. The Great Migration is a movement from the South to the North by African Americans. The goal here was to seek industrial employment. Okay? Yes, did racism push many African Americans out of the South? For sure. Was there racism in the North? 110%. The cities in the North still segregated, still had racial prejudice. Okay? It was not perfect in the North. Was the racism in the South one of the reasons that African Americans wanted to leave? Yes. Did they completely escape it by going to the North? No. What was the piece that drew them in? Industrial jobs. So the Great Migration is also going to help with the labor shortage that we see that was created by men being sent to war. Women and African Americans both fill that big gap. Now, next time we come together, we're going to talk about the impact on civil liberties of the First World War in America. So a little bit more on how this war affected us. Don't forget about your homework, and I will see you next time. Let me know of any questions.